former Governor of Maharashtra, former Delegate UN General Assembly, Thiru.C.Subramaniam, to give a concluding address.
To what you call celebrate the 50th anniversary of UN, I would say instead of celebrating, it should be a stock taking of the 50 years of achievements and failures. As you all know, United Nations was conceived and brought into existence even before the end of the war. But the Allies were quite confident that they were winning the war, and therefore they wanted to look into the future. Can humanity afford to have another world war on the scale of what was happening during the Second World War? As a matter of fact, I don't think the bomb was used at that time when we were conceived the atom bomb was not used at that time. So the enormity of another world war was before them, and therefore they wanted to create a world where there won't be wars between nations and nations, and if there are any disputes or differences between nations, it should be settled by peaceful negotiations and discussions. And therefore the first goal they placed before themselves was to have a human family free from fear of war. So freedom from fear was the first goal which was placed before the United Nations. The second was freedom from want. These were the two main goals which they placed before themselves to be achieved for the humanity as a whole. And therefore we will have to look into how far these two goals have been achieved: the freedom from fear and freedom from want. Fortunately, there had been no great wars, world wars, but little wars have been going on. And if you look into the last 50 years, can you find one year where there was no conflict in the world as a whole? Somewhere or other there were conflicts and fighting going on, unfortunately. And if you look into the genesis of this thing, take for example the Iraq-Iran war. It went on for 8 years, more than the World War, longer than the World War. And if you look into how they were able to fight for 8 years, where did the armaments come from? It's very interesting to see Iran and Iraq were armed from the same sources. And therefore, the beneficiaries were, while they were fighting, the beneficiaries were the armament industry. And even today, if there are problems in the world today, apart from the national conflicts, it is the armament industry which creates the capacity for these nations to fight. And unless that is tackled properly, you will find human beings as they are, greater the potential of the weapons and greater the chances of conflict, and therefore there are bound to be human sufferings as a whole, and that's what we find today. And another pattern that has developed, unfortunately, is the internal conflicts also, not merely between nation and nation, the ethnic conflict which is arising. Therefore, if you take into these factors and the idea of peacekeeping by the United Nations, I am afraid, while they have succeeded in some areas significantly, for example, Suez Canal dispute, etc., but in large number of cases, the peacekeeping had failed. Otherwise, Iran war would not have gone on, Iran-Iraq war would not have gone on for 8 years, with untold suffering to the people there. And selling armaments, and fortunately, these two countries had the oil resources, therefore selling armaments, they were the beneficiaries of the oil resources of these two countries. So you have to go into the, apart from the nuclear weapons, I will deal with it presently. As long as these armament industries are the vested interest in the world today, I am afraid these conflicts cannot be avoided, and perhaps when these armaments are further developed and the potential for destruction is further developed, I am afraid the freedom from fear is not going to be established in the world today. That is why you have to look into the total disarmament, which is the goal of humanity. This is one aspect. The second peculiar aspect is with regard to the nuclear weapons. Everybody says nuclear weapons should be abolished. And unfortunately, there are two sides. One is the nuclear club, and the others are non-nuclear club. And when they want to abolish non-proliferation of atomic weapons, it is confined to non-proliferation in countries where they do not have now. But as far as those who have the atomic weapons, even now the testing is going on. If atomic weapons are not going to be used, why should there be further improvement of those weapons? And it is agreed the present stock of atomic bombs is enough to destroy the world over and over again 7 times or 8 times. That being the case, what is the need for further development and refinement of the atomic weapons? And therefore, total disarmament alone will lead to the freedom from fear. And unfortunately, many countries, their engine of development is based on defense production, armaments production. This is the difficulty today. And this is where Gandhiji's philosophy of non-violence becomes very, very relevant. And unless people are prepared to go to the extent of saying that these armaments should be completely abolished, and in fact abolished, that freedom from fear cannot be established. This is one aspect that will have to be kept in mind, and therefore, after 50 years of functioning of the UN, if they have failed to achieve this objective, then they should assess why this has not been possible, and therefore can we have another strategy for the purpose of establishing the disarmament, total disarmament, which is the goal which everybody agrees should be achieved. This is one aspect that will have to be kept in mind. Second aspect is freedom from want. Unfortunately, if you look into the level of poverty and people living in poverty conditions, in spite of the various scientific and technological developments that have taken place, in spite of the global production increasing 3-fold, 4-fold, there is still large pockets of poverty. If you look into the economic development that has taken place, an assessment has been made. Who are the beneficiaries of these developments that have taken place? We find in the global production, the top 20% gets advantage of 82% of the global production. The bottom 20% they get 1.2%. And in between, the other three, 20%, 7%, 4%, 3%, that's all that is distributed. Therefore, it has become an unequal society as a whole. And this is further intensified in developing countries. And unfortunately today, if you look into the developments that are taking place, particularly on the basis of the new technologies that is coming into existence, poverty is increasing even in developed countries. This is the picture today. Why is it happening? Because a small section of the humanity lives in affluence and the rest of them are in suffering from poverty. This is the picture that has arrived. Again, Mahatma Ji becomes relevant. He stated, there is enough today to satisfy the needs of every one individual in the system. And that is the situation today, apart from what he pronounced 50 years ago. But he said, there is not enough to satisfy the greeds of even a section of the human society. This is the unfortunate situation today. And unfortunately, what is happening is affluent is becoming more affluent. If you take the decade 1980 to 1990, the other figures are not available. The production has almost doubled between these 10 years. But the share between the top 20% and the bottom 20%, as a matter of fact, 10 years ago, it was 80%, and now with increased production, it has further increased to 82%. Therefore, the inequality is increasing. And therefore, unless there is a more equitable society, not on the basis of what we call the communism, that it is based on violence, I will come to that. Therefore, unless there is a more equitable society, freedom from want cannot be eliminated. On the other hand, the affluence will be increasing, particularly the latest developments of knowledge, which is the privilege of a few. Instead of capital-based industries, knowledge-based industries coming into existence, fewer people will be able to produce much more to their own advantage rather than making it available to the rest of the country if the present trend of development is maintained. Therefore, a new strategy for economic development where, while I don't think we can have a society where everybody is equal, but everybody should be able to have the basic minimum needs met first. And over and above that, there is inequality we need not mind. But unfortunately, the basic minimum needs even are not being met today. Therefore, a new economic strategy will have to be evolved where this has to be met. And therefore, where do we begin? This is where a strategy will have to be evolved. Let us begin with the children. I remember my meeting President Johnson for the purpose of getting aid to meet the scarcity conditions that had developed during the 1960s. He was saying at that time Vietnam War was going on. He said, I am going to stop this Vietnam War and all the resources that are being pumped into it, I am going to use it for the greater America. I told him, your ambition seems to be limited. With your resources available, you should have not greater America, but a more equitable society as a whole, where you can't take care of everybody, but begin with the children. That the children of the world will be taken care of by the United States of America, making available to them, at least for the first 5 years, they will get their nutritional requirements, their physical and intellectual development will be taken care of. After that, they will be able to take care of themselves. Therefore, as a matter of fact, when we were talking in terms of a socialist charter in India in the 1960s, when we had the manifesto, Congress manifesto for the, I think the fifth general election, I think, or fourth general election, I insisted you may have a socialist pattern, etc., charter, etc., but let us have a socialist charter for children, that all the children will be taken care of up to the 5 years. This is where we have to begin. And therefore, this is the most important aspect of it that will have to be taken into consideration. Apart from freedom from fear, freedom from want, a third danger has come into existence, and that is the threat of pollution, freedom from pollution. And how does this pollution arise? The pollution arises out of our production of various commodities and providing various services also. Science and technology is used for the purpose of transforming materials which can't be used to usable materials. In that process, not merely you get useful product, there are waste products which are pollutants today. And therefore, more you want to consume, you will have to produce more, and more you produce, there will be more waste materials which pollute the air, water, and soil. This is the picture. And therefore, to think in terms of increasing our production, even now we all feel, and that is what the economists also advocate, unless American economy develops at the rate of 2% or 3%, it won't be possible to eradicate poverty in other rest of the country. And it is on what base this 2%, 3% increase every year takes place, and what will be the effect with reference to pollution when you are not able to control it. And therefore, if we have this philosophy, or I won't call it the philosophy, if a distortion of consumerism, more you consume, you think you will have greater happiness. That is absolutely false today, because a rich country like America is troubled with many more problems than an undeveloped country. You find divided homes, you find single-parent children, you find unmarried mothers. These are the developments that take place mainly because of consumerism. And therefore, if we want to control pollution, unless we control consumption, not that we should go to the primitive stages, only produce which can be produced without pollution, then alone the world can be free from pollution. The one aspect of pollution is, if pollution is not a thing confined to a geographical boundary, pollution in one place can affect the whole of the globe. For example, in Madras, if there is pollution in one area, it is not confined to one area, it spreads to the whole thing. And unfortunately, take our own cities today. We are increasing our automobiles more and more. As a matter of fact, we don't have the infrastructure for these cars to move. But in spite of that, we have traffic jam, etc. And when they are stationary, they are not, it is not as if the engines are working. As a matter of fact, more pollutants are emitted today. And therefore, today, automobile pollution is the worst in most of our cities. In Delhi today, pollution is mainly because of the automobile pollution. So also Bombay, so also Madras, every city. But we think producing more cars marks the progress of the country, and we don't think about these things. Therefore, how to avoid pollution, a global pollution, which threatens the very existence of humanity as a whole? very functioning of the earth system as a whole. And this is another problem which has come into the picture, and no doubt we had the Rio conference, and where for the first time 150 nations were represented to discuss this problem of pollution, and many pious resolutions were passed. And today when you read the articles, United Nations has not taken any step for the purpose of seeing that these resolutions are observed by the various nations. Therefore, the problems are becoming more and more complex. And unfortunately, United Nations is becoming more and more bankrupt also. And that's mainly because of growth, unnecessary growth. If you want to have a demonstration of Parkinson's law, you can examine United Nations, how of the various new places are created, new jobs are created, and they create the jobs for themselves and have more employment. And therefore today it has become a very flabby organization. And if you read many of the articles that are being published today in many of the international journals, we find that the World Organization is instead of setting an example for efficiency and for achievement, on the other hand, it is becoming more and more an inefficient organization. That is the verdict that has come about. Therefore, it is not a question of celebrating the 50 years. On the other hand, what we have got to see, where the United Nations had gone wrong. What are the correctives that are necessary? What are the new directions that have to be given to them? What sort of structure, organizational structure it should have, particularly in the context of a new era we are entering, the new era of knowledge and information society. And some people say perhaps this organization is not necessary. In my view, an organization of like the United Nations is absolutely necessary in the context of the new developments that are taking place. When you think in terms of the whole globe as a global village, unless there is an organizational setup to see that it functions in a harmonious manner, there will be chaos. And therefore, what is important is, it's not the abolition of the United Nations. On the other hand, reorganization or renaissance of United Nations to fulfill the challenges, meet the challenges, the new challenges that are developing in the world as a whole today. And in that task, every one of us will have to participate. And therefore, when we discuss, there is no use of simply paying tribute to the United Organizations. On the other hand, those people who can afford to have the capacity to think, they will have to project their ideas, their thinking with regard to the reorganization of the United Nations. And apart from the United Nations, there are many other allied organizations also, in which I would like to pay a tribute to WHO, which has achieved significant successes in eradicating many of these mass killers, like smallpox, malaria, plague, and other things. But unfortunately, because of consumerism again, another dreadful disease is spreading, AIDS. And therefore, apart from other things, consumerism, it is consumerism which leads to AIDS, etc. And therefore, we have to have organizations to deal with much more complex problems, much more complicated problems. Unless you have the expertise for that, unless you have the organizational structure for that, unless you have the strategy for that, we will find ourselves with greater progress of science and technology. Perhaps the life will become more complicated, more complex, and more difficult. And therefore, let us all work for a United Nations which will be able to deal with these global problems in a successful manner, so that we may have a human family free from fear, free from want, and free from pollution, and free from poverty and destitution. Thank you very much for having given me this opportunity.
Good evening, gentlemen. Once again, I stand before you for the vote of thanks. First of all, I thank Dr. M. Anandakrishnan, Vice Chancellor, Anna University, for having come here and presented a valuable speech on UN. My sincere thanks to Thiru.C.Subramaniam. In spite of his health problem, last month he had his operated his eye. He had come here and presented a memorable lecture and in-depth analysis and ideas to frame a new world structure through UNO. My sincere thanks to you, sir. And also I thank District Governor nominee of Rotary Club, Thiru P.T. Prabhakar, for his valuable speech. And also I thank all the delegates from various colleges, universities, and students and schools from whole Tamil Nadu, and distinguished guests for having attended this function and made this function a grand success. I also thank the media persons, the videographers, and the photographers for made this function so grand and successful. I also further thank to the Rotary Club and other sponsors, Indian Bank, Rotary Club of Madras Mylapore, Kaplan Point Laboratories Limited, Arma Clinical Services, Dr. Nandakumar Sundaram, Dr. Ajit Agarwal for their sponsorship and making this occasion a grand success. And also I thank the Taj Coromandel Administrative Group for their support in making the function so grand. I thank one and all for having present the papers and also present here for the U.N.50th Anniversary Day, a grand success. Thanking you. I once again say that the certificates will be received at the register. You can receive our certificate at the registration counter after the national anthem. Thank you all.
जन गण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे